Hey, if you'd like to earn CEUs for this webinar, join the Safeopedia community at the link in the description below. Now, on to the show.
Thanks so much, Jamie, for the invitation to join you again for Safety Connect. It's been a pleasure. We've made a lot of friends over the last 5 years presenting with you all and hanging out in the lounges and being a part of this awesome community that you guys are building. Jamie also mentioned the webinars that we put on. We've been working, I think, the last 2 years with Safeopedia with doing little quick take videos summarizing or getting people hyped up for our monthly webinars over at Conn Maciel Carey's OSHA webinar series. So we really value our partnership with Safeopedia and have really enjoyed the Safety Connect experience the last several years. So glad to join you all today for what's become a nice annual tradition at Safety Connect, is to get into what's going on at OSHA with the regulator. And I've been providing an OSHA enforcement update and an OSHA rulemaking update across 2 different administrations. A lot of really interesting stuff going on, and this year is certainly no exception to that in terms of the pace that things are coming at us from OSHA and sort of the unpredictability of it, because we are walking into a national election. People are voting right now in an election that can have a major impact on what this presentation looks like next year if I'm invited back. Is the pendulum going to swing to a different administration that has different enforcement priorities or a different philosophy about enforcement? Is rulemaking that's been steaming full steam ahead, is that going to slow down, grind to a halt, or are we going to see a bunch of new rules? But that's what we'll get into a little bit today, of what's been going on, where we're headed next. And I thought a good place to start would be an OSHA enforcement update. And this is kind of an interesting trend line here. We've got this broken down by sort of the Obama administration, total number of Fed OSHA inspections, then the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration, the 3 full years of data that we have from that. And it's interesting to see a couple of things, and we talked about this, I'm sure, in the past a little bit, that we didn't see any significant drop-off in the number of inspections that OSHA was conducting as we transitioned from the Obama to the Trump administration. But then 2020, 2021, the dark years, the pandemic hit, and it had a major impact on OSHA. I mean, first they were extremely focused, kind of all hands on deck on the pandemic itself, pandemic response, and like every other business, trying to figure out how to do the job in this new world. So they were out in the field a lot less. They were doing a lot more compliance counseling, a lot more education on the COVID hazard, but plenty of enforcement on that as well. But their field staff reduced, in part because of different priorities during the Trump administration, but also just the unpredictability of the world during the pandemic. We saw OSHA at its lowest levels of field staff, many openings in the area offices and regional offices, and the pandemic response itself. We saw a huge drop off, almost 50% fewer inspections during the pandemic than during the peak of the Obama administration. And then, new administration, new enforcement philosophy, and a real commitment to regrowing the ranks at OSHA. And they added several hundred new employees at OSHA over the last 3 years. That was sort of priority number 1 for Doug Parker, the head of OSHA. And as a result of that, you can see that we've moved back to pre-pandemic levels entirely by the end of last year, by the end of last fiscal year, around October of last year, that we saw OSHA conduct the most inspections that it had conducted since 2015. That number I know is higher this year. We don't have the official final count yet because the fiscal year is not over yet, but we know that it's going to be ahead of last year. So the trend line continues. So OSHA's back out in the field. They're doing their thing. They're conducting inspections, issuing citations, and you can see in this the box in the bottom right corner of the slide that when they open an inspection, they're very, very likely to issue citations. Approximately 65% of the time, an inspection will result in at least one citation, and then 85% of those citations that OSHA issues are serious or worse. So OSHA enforcement is strong at the moment. This is a slide that it's updated, but one that I've been reporting on to this group, to this audience, for each of the last several years as well. And this is the trend of OSHA issuing a greater percentage of its citations characterized as repeat. And that's a big deal because I think, everybody here that deals in the OSHA space knows that OSHA penalties for willful and repeat violations can be 10 times higher than penalties associated with serious and other than serious violations. And OSHA, with that greater penalty authority, has been really, really consciously looking for and citing and characterizing more citations as repeat violations. And they've done that by rewriting their rule book, how they define, how they characterize citations as repeat violations. It used to be that they would look at a single facility and look for a substantially similar violation at that same facility for it to be cited as a repeat violation. OSHA has, within the last couple of decades, broke down that barrier and said, we're no longer limiting ourselves to a single facility. Any facility within a federal OSHA jurisdiction controlled by the same corporate entity, it's like one big workplace for purposes of repeat violations. So that greatly increased the potential that OSHA would be back after issuing citations and much more likely to have multiple targets to be shot at for repeat violations. Likewise, OSHA looked back further in time. The old policy used to be that they would look back 3 years for prior violations to serve as the basis for a repeat. Now they look back 5 years, and really that's just a policy, and they've announced and they actually litigated successfully to establish that they're not bound even by the 5 years, that they could go back literally to the first citation OSHA ever issued in the 1970s as the basis for a new repeat violation. They're not going back that far, but we have seen them 6 years, 7 years where it suits their purpose in a particular enforcement action. And then finally, OSHA has become a much more proactive agency rather than sitting back and waiting for incidents, reports of hospitalizations or fatalities. They are handpicking industries that they want to visit more, handpicking individual employers through programs like the Site-Specific Targeting Program or the Severe Violator Enforcement Program, targeting specific hazards in national, regional, and local emphasis programs, all with the idea that they're going to get into your facilities even if you haven't had an incident, which makes it much more likely, because they're targeting specific industries, specific hazards, and in some instances, targeting specific employers, they're much more likely to visit you multiple times during the 5, 6, or 7 year period, which makes it more likely that they'll issue repeat citations. And you can see the data speaks for itself. Year after year after year after year, the percentage of total OSHA citations that are characterized as repeat increases. And that's really where our eyes have been the last decade or so. But this past year saw an explosion in the number of willful violations as well. So that's something else that we're going to need to start tracking and paying attention to. So very interesting data on that front. The net effect of all of this, getting out in the field more, issuing a very high percentage of citations and a very high percentage of inspections, issuing more repeat and willful violations, and just in general, watching OSHA's penalty authority increase every year as it does with inflation and with very high levels of inflation the last couple of years. OSHA's penalty authority now is much higher. All of that combined has resulted in OSHA issuing a lot more what we call significant enforcement actions than they ever have before, right? Breaking records. Every year of this administration is breaking records. And what we used to track is citations were the total penalty of the package, however many citations it is, with $100,000 or more total penalty. How many of those are we seeing every year? And this year, this past fiscal year, OSHA issued nearly 400, I'm sorry, nearly 400 of those $100,000 plus enforcement actions, just federal OSHA alone. But what we started to see during this administration was that it was no longer sort of the 105, 110, $120,000 citations. It was the 300,000, 500,000, $1 million citations. So we went back and started to track how many in those sort of bigger categories at 250,000 to $1 million or $1 million plus. And what we saw was that in this last fiscal year, OSHA was issuing more $250,000 plus enforcement actions than 10 years ago during the Obama administration. They were issuing $100,000 plus enforcement actions. So it is a really totally different ballgame out there now from an enforcement standpoint. And this trend is not going to stop, at least for 2024's data, will look like this. It may be very different if depending on what happens in the election, but this is the trend line that we're on now, and one that has the potential to continue or to pivot. But again, we talked about there wasn't a big drop off in citations during at the beginning of the prior Trump administration. Similar data point here. Look at 2017. 2017 and 18 and 19, really all the years prior to the pandemic, the Trump administration maintained pretty robust levels of significant enforcement actions. Who knows what's going to happen, but I would remind everybody that during those 4 years, there was never a Senate confirmed presidentially appointed head of OSHA. So it was, by and large, OSHA was being run maybe more so by career officials than political officials. Maybe that changes if there is a second Trump administration. Maybe that really had no impact at all on OSHA sort of continuing the course during the prior Trump administration. And maybe there won't be another Trump administration, but these are the big questions. And that's why we like to look back at data and say, well, what is likely to happen one way or the other? And this gives you sort of a little bit of a trend line, right? 2021 to 2023 is probably what we'll see of a trend line with a Harris-Walz administration. 2017 to 2019, carving out the COVID year, is probably a pretty good trend line for what to expect from a second Trump administration at OSHA. Flat, but not disappearing, right? You can't ignore OSHA. They're still doing their job, but not increasing, setting records year over year, like we probably would see with a continuation of, a Harris, essentially a second Biden-Harris administration, but a Harris-Walz administration. So interesting look back at data there. A couple other things on the enforcement front that I think are really worth paying attention to are some new tools that OSHA handed itself a year ago and what impact that's having on enforcement. The first big one is that OSHA expanded the opportunity for the agency to use what's called egregious enforcement or per instance or instance by instance citation. That's where, historically you'd see, a citation with 10 instances. It's just a single citation with a single penalty. But if OSHA wanted to, and the circumstances were appropriate for it, they would issue an egregious enforcement action and break up those 10 instances into 10 separate violations of the same standard, each with its own penalty. And so, rather than having a single, $120,000 PPE violation, you might have 10 $120,000 PPE violations for each employee who was found not wearing his hard hat on a construction site in a willful violation. And then that's how you get these $1 million fines, is these per instance citations. Well, historically, since the 1990s, OSHA only did that in circumstances that we called willful violations plus some aggravating circumstance like a death or multiple hospitalizations, a whole bunch of violations in that same inspection, a long history of similar violations over years, or just conduct that OSHA characterizes as clear bad faith. If you had those circumstances, they would break up those individual instances of violations into multiple separate violations, each with their own penalty. Last year, OSHA expanded that tool to no longer be limited to that high threshold of willful plus Instead, now they could do it for serious violations, for some other than serious violations, and even repeat violations. We started to see those kinds of per instance violations since January 2023 after OSHA released this new directive. So it takes high gravity serious violations. It takes a standard that creates an individualized duty, but a much lower threshold now to see those per instance citations, and another way for OSHA to really raise those total penalties in enforcement actions. The last big tool that we saw changed last year, and that we're seeing big effects from that change this year, is expanding the Severe Violator Enforcement Program. This is an enforcement program that OSHA uses to dedicate its enforcement resources, meaning, where are we going to target for inspections? Employers that OSHA believes have demonstrated indifference to their OSHA Act obligations. And OSHA historically, since this program came into existence in 2010, have limited the circumstances that they qualify, and that's their term, qualifying, like you've won a prize or something, but to qualify employers into the Severe Violator Enforcement Program, you had to be accused by OSHA, not confirmed, just alleged, which is something I find broken about this program. But in any event, alleged to have committed violations in certain categories. The main category that was sweeping in the vast majority of employers into the Severe Violator Enforcement Program was employers who were alleged to have committed 2 or more willful, repeat, or failure to abate violations related to a really small subset of specific high emphasis hazards. And it was the hazards that generally OSHA had a national emphasis program about: fall hazards, combustible dust, the grain industry, trenching and excavations, lockout, tagout, and guarding. But it was about 9 different sets of standards that if you were alleged to have committed 2 or more willful or repeats just in those categories, just those 9 categories, you would qualify into this program. And we were seeing on an average about 90 employers every year qualify into the Severe Violator Enforcement Program. And I could go on for days about why you don't want that. I think you could tell by the name. That's not something you want to be a part of. It's OSHA's bad actors list. They dedicate, they're going to do tons of follow-up inspections and inspections at sister facilities. They put you on a public list of bad actors on their website. Really ugly press releases, the whole thing. You don't want to be a part of it. But OSHA determined after a dozen years or so of this program that 100 a year, 90 a year wasn't enough. They weren't tarring enough employers with this ugly brush. So they expanded the criteria to qualify employers into the program. So now, instead of 2 or more willful or repeats in those 9 categories of special standards, now it's any standard, any hazard, any industry, 2 or more high gravity, willful, repeat, or failure to abate violations in a single inspection would qualify you into the Severe Violator Enforcement Program. So by blowing open the portfolio of standards that are eligible to turn you into a severe violator, OSHA tripled the number of employers that it qualified into the Severe Violator Enforcement Program in 2023 in a partial year, right? They made this change like in late winter, early spring of 2023. So in about 2/3 of a year, they managed to triple the number of employers they were qualifying in. We have no doubt, looking at the trends, looking at the number of repeat and willful violations we saw so far in 2024, there's no doubt that trend is going to continue, and we are likely to see, more than 300, maybe even, pushing 400 employers every year qualifying into the Severe Violator Enforcement Program. So that is my recap on enforcement. And now we'll pivot over to rulemaking. And there's been a ton of activity in rulemaking, sort of wild amount of activity in rulemaking this year for a few reasons. One is OSHA is generally not that quick to promulgate new rules. Usually it takes them a decade or longer to promulgate a rule. We usually see maybe one new rule every 2 or 3 or 4 years out of OSHA. And in election years, you really almost never see any activity. Usually the incumbent president doesn't want to make a bunch of waves, doesn't want to make a bunch of unpopular new regulations leading up to an election. Well, we saw exactly the opposite this year, that OSHA did not put its head down and try to avoid making waves. They were extremely active. And talking with some of my friends at OSHA, it seemed like this was kind of making up for lost time where during the pandemic they felt cheated, that they weren't able to focus on their priorities that they wanted to focus on for the first year and a half, 2 years of their administration. It was all hands on deck with COVID rulemaking, COVID guidance, COVID enforcement, and they really didn't get to do a lot of the things that they wanted to do. And so they are going to work right up until the last possible moment, putting out new rules, advancing rules that are in earlier stages. And so I wanted to focus on two particular rulemakings this year, one that was finalized just a couple of months ago, and one that has just been proposed. Like there's a notice of proposed rulemaking that was just published in the Federal Register. And those two rules are OSHA's worker walk-around representative designation process rule. That's the rule that was finalized. And then we'll talk about their heat illness, indoor and outdoor heat illness prevention standard that they are pushing as far along in the process as they can before this election, with the hope that they could get it finalized by next summer if there is a Harris-Walz administration. If not, if we're Trump 2.0, I don't anticipate that the heat standard will be finalized next year or anytime during that term. But OSHA is pushing it as far and as fast as it can right now. Let's talk about this worker walk-around representative designation process rule. This is a really interesting rule with a really interesting history. To begin with, like any other good OSHA story, you've got to go back at least a decade. And this one, we go back to 2013. During the Obama-Biden administration, there was a coordinated effort between a big national union and OSHA to sort of reconceptualize when third parties could participate in OSHA inspections, and in particular, when unions could participate in inspections on behalf of employees at non-union workplaces. Right, very well established that elected unions with a collective bargaining agreement are the authorized representative of employees at a workplace, and that they have a role to play in OSHA inspections. They participate in the opening conference, they participate in the walk around, they sit in on interviews with employees in the bargaining unit, and that's been well recognized. But it has been also pretty well recognized for the last 50 years of OSHA's operations that third parties are generally not welcome to participate in OSHA inspections. And there is, in fact, a regulation on the books that, while it is intended to promote representation for employees during OSHA inspections, it makes it clear that there is an extreme bias, almost an outright prohibition against participation in OSHA inspections by employee representatives who are not employees of the employer. Unless they're a union, and often the union representative is an employee of the employer or the union steward, somebody like that. But if it's at least an elected union, it can be a third party in that capacity. But other than that, OSHA's regulation in 1903.8c said representatives authorized by employees to serve as their inspection representative shall be employees of the employer, right? We know what OSHA thinks shall means when it applies to some standard. Whether we need to comply with it, it means absolutely shall, no doubt. But the regulation says, however, if in the judgment of the OSHA compliance officer, good cause has been shown why accompaniment by a third party, such as a certified industrial hygienist or a professional safety engineer, is reasonably necessary for OSHA conducting a thorough and effective OSHA inspection, then OSHA may allow that third party to accompany the inspector during the physical inspection, the physical walk-around. That's the regulation. This union went to OSHA in 2013. I think they coordinated this in advance and said, hey, notwithstanding 1903.8c, can employees designate a union representative at a non-union workplace to serve as their OSHA walk-around representative? And despite that regulatory text that makes it pretty clear to me that the answer has got to be no to that question, OSHA responded and said, well, although we recognize The 1903.8C says that most employee representatives will be employees of the employer. It's our view that if there's a third party that will make a positive contribution, we'd welcome them to the inspection, and we would welcome a union representative at a non-union site. Industry looked at this and said, wait a second, this looks to us like you've basically rewritten this regulation, but you did it by an interpretation letter, not a rule. That's unlawful. And they challenged it. And that was going through litigation, successful through the earliest stages of the litigation. It looked for sure like the challenging petitioners were going to prevail, and that letter was going to be deemed unlawful. But before the federal court could issue a final judgment, there was an election. Trump administration took over, and in one of their first actions, one of their first OSHA-related actions, they rescinded that interpretation letter and said, we're back to the way we always were. It would be the extremely rare exception that a third party would be permitted, and they really do need to be some sort of technical safety expert, a certified industrial hygienist, a professional safety engineer, not this union at non-union worksite interpretation. So another election happens. We swing back the other direction. The Biden administration comes in and says, hey, we like that policy. We want to do that again, but lesson learned. Maybe it wasn't right to do it as an interpretation letter. It sure seemed like the courts were going to, not allow us to do that. So let's do it by rulemaking. And they did that, and they did it extremely quickly. They prompted this rulemaking in January 2023, basically saying we want to memorialize our 2013 interpretation letter. We want to facilitate unions getting access to non-union workplaces during OSHA inspections. That's the purpose of the rule. We're not hiding our purpose, and we want to do that. They moved very quickly. By August, they issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. By April of this year, the final rule was published in the Federal Register, went into effect. It's already in effect as of June 1st. And the state plans out there, Cal OSHA, Virginia OSHA, South Carolina OSHA, all over the country, the state plans were directed by OSHA to adopt this rule or one that's at least as effective, substantially similar, within 6 months. That's basically the end of this year. I don't anticipate that very many of the states will actually get this done by the end of this year. But if they're not moving, if there's no steps being taken in that direction, Fed OSHA is going to start leaning on them. So if you're operating in a state plan state, this is coming to you soon. And let's talk about what this is. OSHA made 3 changes to this regulation, or they set about to make 3 changes. The first was to eliminate this extreme bias or prohibition against third-party participation. So they rewrote that first sentence of 1903.8C to, instead of saying authorized representatives shall be an employee of the employer, what they proposed and what they finalized said that representatives authorized by employees may be an employee of the employer or a third party. We're indifferent on this. We are neutral. We would welcome a third party just as happily as we would, the employee rep on the safety committee, or, some other employee of the employer in that role. So blew the door open to, make it much easier for a third party to participate. The second big change they made was to eliminate that defining criteria for what made somebody eligible or qualified to serve as a third-party employee inspection representative. Where it used to talk about certified industrial hygienist or professional safety engineer, they replaced that with saying basically anyone with relevant knowledge, skills, or experience with hazards or conditions in the workplace we're inspecting or similar workplaces, or language or communication skills. So blowing the door open again to the nature of the person who is eligible or qualified to serve in this role. And the third thing they proposed to do was to expand the role that these third parties might play in OSHA inspections, where it used to be very clear that we were talking about the physical inspection of the workplace. They tried to replace that accompany and accompaniment language, walking side by side during the physical inspection, to replace that with participate and participation. And we coaxed out of our friends at OSHA that they intended this to really truly be a broader scope, sitting in on those interviews, which, by the way, many of those interviews during an OSHA inspection are private interviews. The employer doesn't have a right to sit in. Now this third party, non-governmental third party, would have a right to sit in those interviews, even without the employer being present. Perhaps access to records, perhaps, making requests for records or suggesting documents that OSHA should be asking for and getting to see those things, getting access to physical evidence, a much broader role than was ever contemplated by this regulation. We pushed back during the rulemaking and successfully got OSHA to drop that change. So the rule does now still say accompany and accompaniment during the physical inspection. But we know that OSHA, through some guidance they've already put out, contemplate basically just ignoring that they didn't actually change the words in the rule, and that they do intend to permit, if an employee requests it, to have these third parties sit in on interviews and the like with them. My biggest issue with this rule, and I will sit here and I'm not going to, say anything about unions, non-union work sites, union policy at all, because that's not what concerns me about this rule. I mean, I do frankly feel like OSHA regulations ought to be purely about safety and health and not about facilitating union organizing, even if, whatever you believe about unions and union access. If the Department of Labor believes that there needs to be a rule to make that easier, the National Labor Relations Board should issue that rule, not OSHA. But that's not what has me worried about this rule. That was OSHA's intent, but that's not the rule they wrote. They didn't write a rule that limited this to unions at non-union work sites. They wrote a rule that opens the door to all kinds of other third parties, including what keeps me up at night: plaintiffs' attorneys, expert witnesses, disgruntled former employees, the media, competitors, activist groups, customers. Any number of individuals may be able to use this rule to wedge their way into the workplace shortly after an incident, or shortly after discipline of a disgruntled former employee, termination of a disgruntled former employee, to cause all kinds of different problems. That plaintiff's attorney wants to get in there and start to build their wrongful death or personal injury case. And ordinarily, under the rules of civil procedure, they don't ever get access the way that OSHA does. And whatever access they get, it's months down the road, and it's much more narrow than OSHA's broad subpoena authority, OSHA's broad warrant authority. But now, if they can convince, in very sympathetic circumstances, one or two or three employees at the work site to say, pick me to come in and be your inspection representative, they can get in the door the day after a serious incident, get access to physical evidence, get access to maybe even manipulate witnesses, sitting in a private interview and manipulating them to a certain version of the story that will support the wrongful death or personal injury tort action they're trying to develop, get access to documents that they would never in a million years get access to in discovery, because they're just basically following on and looking over OSHA's shoulder with its broad inspection and subpoena authority. So very concerning in that regard. And then the disgruntled former employee, right? I can't see any of you, but if I said show of hands, how many of you have ever received a bogus safety complaint from OSHA the day or two or three after you fired an employee for very good cause, having nothing to do with safety? I'm assuming everybody is raising their hands right now. It happens all the time. This is, a big part of our practice is helping employers respond to those kinds of bogus complaints, or helping to manage inspections where OSHA takes the bait on these bogus complaints. Now carry that a step further. This disgruntled employee complains to OSHA. OSHA takes the bait and does an inspection. This disgruntled former employee goes to his now former coworkers and says, pick me to be your inspection representative. I know the hazards of this workplace. I know the details of this process and the procedures and the equipment, and I can be a great help to OSHA and a great headache to the employer. Pick me and I'll go in and make life hell for the employer. Hey, why not? My old drinking buddy, my old bowling buddy, I'll pick you, no big deal. Two of them do it. They say to OSHA, this is who we want. OSHA's open to it because they've already accepted the whistleblower complaint from this individual. They know it's him or her, and they would welcome that participation. And they're going to come in and, you know, all the problems that you would be concerned about with a disgruntled former employee: physical safety and security, theft of trade secrets and proprietary information, sabotage, or just, you know, retaliation against you for terminating or disciplining the employee. So very concerning development with this rule. I'm going to very quickly go through some tips and strategies. So I've got just a couple of minutes at least to talk about the proposed heat rule. The first thing we recommend here is, if there is the possibility that OSHA is going to bring along a third party that is not welcome at your facility and force you to allow them in, is you need to be prepared for how you're going to deal with that. And in general, be prepared for OSHA inspections and this contingency element of OSHA inspections. And at a gratuitous plug here, I'd recommend you sign up for our OSHA inspection masterclass at Conn Maciel Carey. Whether you're worried about third parties or not, it's a great tool to develop your inspection team, to train your inspection team on best practices for managing all the various stages of an OSHA inspection to successful results. But we would also get into you know, this third party concept. How can we address this issue and perhaps avoid having to welcome in an unwelcome third party during an OSHA inspection? More specific to third party participation is some ideas that we have about really challenging from the outset the role of this third party, or the right of this third party to participate in the inspection. And first suggestion we have is that whenever the opportunity first arises, maybe it's in the opening conference, if the third party happens to be present, or if OSHA tells you during the opening conference that they intend to let this third party participate, we suggest basically doing, these are lawyers' concepts here, voir dire, right? You question the background about that individual. Or Daubert, which is, I think, is a better example. That's when you question whether an expert witness that's been introduced by a party in litigation, you question whether they're legitimately an expert. If you can demonstrate that they're not, they get excluded from the case. They don't get to give their opinion testimony. We're doing the same kind of thing here. We're challenging whether this third party really has a rightful purpose in the OSHA inspection. And if you get the opportunity to question the third party directly, do that. Prepare. What are the questions that I want to ask to get to the core of whether this person really has relevant knowledge or skills in this industry? What is their experience with this workplace or similar workplaces? And then the second component of that test is that their participation needs to be reasonably necessary. Really question OSHA about that. Why do you need this person for you, OSHA, to be able to do this effectively? How many manufacturing facilities have you inspected over your career? And why can you not do this one effectively without this third party that we don't believe has a legitimate role? Question them, OSHA and the third party, with two goals in mind. One is maybe OSHA decides not to let the third party participate and says, you know what, we're convinced now that they don't really have the right relevant knowledge, skills, or experience, and that we don't really need them for us to do our job effectively, so we're going to exclude them. Or more likely, OSHA's already made up its mind, but you've gathered a bunch of information through that questioning to use in the context of a warrant challenge. And I will tell you, I've been practicing in this field, workplace safety and health law, exclusively as an OSHA defense lawyer for almost 25 years. And I could count on one hand the number of times that I've recommended to one of my clients that they ask for a warrant during an OSHA inspection. But this new rule might be a little bit of a game changer for that. And there may be circumstances where there are third parties that we absolutely would not welcome into our workplace. And if that's being forced on us, then we may consider demanding a warrant. And my suggestion around that is to, you know, communicate as best you can to OSHA how much you welcome the agency. We share the agency's mission. We respect you. We are ready to start this inspection right now with you, and we have no challenge, and we are not demanding a warrant for you to do your inspection, OSHA. We could get going right now, but if you are really going to insist that this third party, that you require us to welcome this third party into our workplace, we're going to require a warrant from a federal court that says that this third party has a legitimate role to play and can participate. And we hate to do it. We're sorry to do it, But if you need to, if you need this third party, you're going to insist on this third party, we're going to have to insist on a warrant only as to the third party. Now, OSHA, maybe they take that a little bit better than when you just question their authority and say, we're not welcoming you in without a warrant. But however they take it, there will be circumstances where we think that that's the better strategic option. And then you take that information you've gathered about the background of this third party and use that to challenge their role when you get an opportunity to present to a judge why the warrant should not include this third party. A couple other tips in that regard. We've recommended that employers develop a really onerous non-disclosure agreement, confidentiality agreement, and require that this third party sign that. And OSHA has said in its FAQs that they're fine with that they're not going to interfere with you requiring these third party inspection representatives to sign an NDA or a confidentiality agreement. They do say, though, that you have to do it consistently, that you can't only require an NDA when your employees are seeking to be represented during an OSHA inspection. You need to apply that consistently. And I think that's right. I think that's fine. I don't think you need to do it with every third party, but similar third parties, right? Maybe not your business partners, your contractors, your vendors that you have a business relationship with and some other kind of agreement with, but just really members of the public, any generic member of the public, non-governmental that might come into your workplace. As long as you're consistently requiring an NDA with them, you can do it for these third parties. Similarly, OSHA says that you can designate areas of your workplace as sensitive trade secret areas. I'd go a bit further to say sensitive confidential business information areas. And if there are places that you don't open to the public, and for a lot of workplaces, that's like the entire workplace or everything beyond the main entrance and reception area is not open to the public, and it contains our proprietary information. So we're not going to let a third party in there, and OSHA will allow you to do that. The last thing we recommend in that regard is to pick a better alternative to be your employee's inspection representative and hold that person out to OSHA and say, look, we've got a safety committee. We've got these special safety work groups, and we've got non-supervisory employees that serve in those groups. They've already been picked by their coworkers to be their safety representative. They know the workplace. Their coworkers are comfortable with them. You don't need this third party because you've got this alternative right here. And maybe that makes it easier for OSHA to reject the third party. So I think that brings us pretty much to the end of the hour. I'm going to save for another day heat illness. And if anybody has questions or anything about OSHA's heat illness standard, reach out to me. I'd be very happy to talk you through what's going on there. And I would invite you even more specifically to join a coalition of employers that we've been developing to work on this rule, to submit comments, to testify to OSHA, to testify to the White House, and to advocate for a reasonable heat illness standard, because what OSHA has proposed is not exactly reasonable. And just this one slide alone sort of lays out the whole structure of the heat standard. It shows you where the thresholds kick in. These are heat index numbers, not ambient temperature. So at 80 degrees Fahrenheit heat index, everything that's in that middle column is elements of the rule that kick in. And then at high heat, 90 degrees heat index or higher, all these other elements kick in. And there's a few that are really, really onerous. The measuring and monitoring, particularly for indoor workplaces, you're going to become a weatherman. You've got to go around your workplace multiple times a day to multiple locations and measure and calculate the heat index. You're either getting some fancy new tool to get the heat index, or you're taking ambient temperature and humidity and calculating heat index multiple times a day to know whether you're triggering any of these requirements. So that's a big deal. The other one is a very rigid break, cool down rest period requirement, which we've got no problem with cool down rest periods. But OSHA is saying 15 minutes every 2 hours. And there may be circumstances where it's better to go 4 hours and take a 30-minute break. And it might be safer. You don't have to climb down from a wind tower in the middle of a 3-hour work task. So you're climbing up and down twice. Let's be more flexible about that. And then the last big one is acclimatization, where OSHA is going to require you to gradually ease in workers over the course of their first week on the job 20% of a work shift the first day, 40%, 60%, 80%, and having to track, where people are in their acclimatization process, what percentage of the day they've been exposed to heat. And, that may be manageable for new employees, but this also covers returning employees. Anybody who's been away for 2 weeks has to be reacclimatized. So think about the administrative challenge of tracking who's been away for 14 days, how far into their reacclimatization are they, what point in the day did it hit this temperature, and so I've got to make sure I keep them out of the heat no more than 40% today. We're looking for better solutions for how to acclimatize than that. And that's what we're working on. And I'd encourage all of you to reach out if you're interested in having a seat at the table for this rulemaking. And we welcome you and would love to talk to you about that.